Greetings YouTube. Today I'm going to discuss the True20 role-playing game. Now, if anyone who's ever watched any of my gaming videos probably knows, I'm a fan of the D20 system. I consider the 3rd edition of the D&D game to be the best there is, and the OGL, the Open Gaming License, the greatest gift that the gaming community has ever received. I know that this makes me a bit of a grognard. I'm okay with that. So, I had never gotten a chance to around to looking at the D20, the True20 system. I don't know why, it just didn't happen. And I recently read a book that was based on the modern 20, a version thereof. So it got me interested to get myself in gear and start looking at it. So I've looked at a couple of the books already, and I'm currently reading one at the moment while I am waiting to get another gaming product bound so I can read that. My gaming queue is somewhat long when it comes to reading material. So, if you are familiar at all with the D20 system, the 3rd edition D&D game, you have a good working knowledge of how True20 functions. But the design goal behind True20 was to take out some of the complexity and make the game truly generic so that it could be used for not just fantasy settings, but for modern horror, science fiction, horror survival, the Old West, a true generic system, which is a laudable goal in my opinion. So, how'd they do? So off the bat, I'll tell you right now, I think True20 really does present itself well as a generic version of the D20 system. Now there's a caveat here. This really does, to me, come across as a Lego set. And I love Legos. Legos are a wonderful invention. They are a great toy. They are a great tool. They're a great invention as far as fueling creativity. But they have limitations. Because of those little block shapes and the odd things that occasionally they develop, you are limited by essentially the quanta of the medium itself. Now, the quanta of Legos is pretty cool. It still allows a lot of flexibility. But there are things you can't do with Legos. And I think that would hold true for True20. That this is a good, solid, generic OGL game that does a lot of things, but it's not going to meet everyone's needs because by the very nature, it's very structured because it's based on the OGL, it's not going to have the full range to meet everyone's needs. And that's okay. There are people like myself that are going to have most of their needs met, and if there is a particular adventure style I want to do that doesn't suit this, there are hundreds of role-playing games out there I have to choose from. But I can tell you right now that this would be a system that I would run without a problem for a lot of different genres. So, let's do a little into the meat of this. I'll use the table of contents for the most of this review because it's oh so convenient. I love a good table of contents. I give thumbs up for anyone that does that. A good table of contents and a good index at the back of the game can really make or break a product, in my opinion, and they did a good, excellent job in that regard. So we have an introduction that talks about the origin of True20. It grew out of the adventure romance game Blue Rose, which I actually haven't gotten around to reading yet. I need to do that at some point. And then they decided they wanted to make a generic version of the OGL for everybody, not just those that wanted to do a romantic adventure style that Blue Rose put forth. We have a bit on the introduction, of course, basics, gameplay, important terms. Then we have hero creation. Now, this is the point where it begins to diverge from traditional OGL. The traditional OGL has statistics, strength, intelligence, etc., with a range of 3 to 18. And if 10 is the nominal score, if you have every 2 points above 10, you get a +1 bonus. Every 2 points below 10, you get a -1 penalty. They've done away with the numbers except for the bonuses and penalties. So everyone starts out with a score of 0 in all their stats, and you can spend character points, development points, when you're making a character, to increase the bonus, or you can take a penalty so you have more points to spend to get a bonus somewhere else. So you can start the game with a strength score, for example, as high as +5, which would be equivalent to a 20, or something as low as a -5, which is pretty much, you are incapable of thinking at that point. Below that, you're a lump. You either have no strength, or you have no constitution, or you have no dexterity. So this allows you to have the full range of 3 to 18 without having to worry about doing the math. And I think that is simple and a bit of brilliant insight. I'm surprised that someone else hasn't done that before. I don't know if anyone else has ever done it before. I don't think they have. But they get my respect for coming up with an elegant solution to having to figure out what 15 gives you for a bonus. You don't have to worry about that anymore. It's no 15 numbers to play with. Then we have backgrounds, figuring out your backgrounds. For example, you're playing an academic character, you're playing a military character, things like that. Then we have the roles in the game. There are only 3 roles. They don't call them character classes, they call them roles. And the 3 roles are Adept, Expert, and Warrior. And those who are familiar with the OGL will tell you those sound a whole lot like the NPC generic classes, and they do. They took those NPC classes and really turned them into fully functional classes using the same terms, because that will be allowed because they're in the OGL, and allowed them to have the full range of player character options that other versions of the OGL has. Now, Adept is going to cover all of your magical needs. Arcane, Divine, Psionic, anything that is power-based is going to be running. You're going to be using an Adept, some version of an Adept, to play. The Expert is going to carry all your skill monkey stuff. These are the people that are good at stuff. Your rogues, thieves, rangery type of stuff. And then you also have the warriors, straight up. These are the people that you hire when you want something hit and broken. Now you can also mix and match these different roles. So you could have a warrior that has some expert stuff, ranger. Expert that has some magical stuff. Get the point? You can mix and match to create the class that you want from the OGL, that if it doesn't exist. Sorry, it's a little chilly in here. It's 60 degrees. Then we have skills, which are going to be familiar to everyone. They've made the skills more generic, which is good because they need to be applied in more than one genre. Feats, again, the feats are a little more generic. They've rolled a couple of things here and there into each other to make them a little more streamlined, which is I have no problem with. Then we have the powers themselves. Now this is from Green Ronin, and they used their fatigue-based Psychic's Handbook as the base model of the power system. And what that means is that if you say I want to cast a fireball, you cast a fireball and you make a save. If you make the save, you cast your fireball. It's skill-based. If you fail that roll by a certain number, you take fatigue. And it gets you tired, it wears you down. So it's a skill-based system that can sap your strength over time until you can't cast your divine spells, or your arcane spells, or use your psychic powers. And of course there are going to be feats and things that are going to help mitigate that, because every game has a way to counterbalance the other mechanics. So there's all kinds of different powers listed in here, and again they're fairly generic. And they can even be used, for example, in a modern setting. For example, even though it's setting without magic, you can say that someone has studied physiology a lot, and they're a bodybuilder, so they can use an enhanced strength ability, not because they're magic, but because they know how to perfectly place themselves for that lift. And that's how you're changing the fluff description, but using the same mechanic. Then they go on to wealth, and the wealth does not use money. It uses a wealth roll. You have a wealth score, and every item in the game is going to have a DC against that. So, for example, you want to get a rope. Rope, say, has a DC of 5. Anybody can pretty much get rope with a decent roll. But say you want a sword, it may have a DC of 15, which means poor people aren't going to have access to them. And a masterwork sword, 20. Okay, so your bonus is going to with your wealth score is going to mean getting more expensive things more easy. And if you're really dirt cheap, dirt broke, if you're a beggar in the streets, you're not going to have a lot of equipment, which again makes sense. And less bookkeeping. So I kind of like the whole money thing, and I really think that money belongs in like a fantasy game. I can understand why they wanted to get rid of it for a generic system, because you don't have to worry about converting gold pieces to dollars and dollars to science fiction domars or credits. I have a section on generic equipment, general equipment rather, and this is going to cover fantasy, modern, and somewhat futuristic stuff, because again, this is a generic system. Then we deal with weapons, and the weapons are very simple in this game, and because they're not using a hit point system, I'll get to that in a minute. Weapons don't do damage per, like, it's not doing a die 6 or die 8 or 2 die 4 or something like that. It's doing a bonus, so like a short sword I think is +2, and a great sword I think is +3 or 4, something like that. And so when you're rolling, those bonuses are added into the mechanics for doing damage. But the weapons themselves don't have a die associated with them any longer. And they break them into melee, ranged, and grenade and explosives, and there aren't a lot of them because it's supposed to be generic, so they didn't want to have a huge list including all the possible melee and all the possible firearms and things. So they gave you some basic guidelines, and you could very easily just add and subtract what weapons you need for your game. Then they have armor, archaic armors, fantasy stuff. Modern armor, ballistic, bulletproof materials, things like that, helmets, military helmets, things like that, and then of course shields. Then we have vehicles, ground vehicles, water vehicles, air vehicles, and space vehicles, all familiar to everybody who's ever watched any kind of modern fantasy or science fiction movie. Then we have supernatural items, which would fall into the category of alchemy, things like that. And we have playing the game, physical actions, moving, carrying, throwing, extra effort, social interactions, influencing attitudes, and social interaction. Then we get into fighting. Now, the fighting in here is going to be familiar to anybody in the game, but who's familiar with the game. You roll your die 20, you put in your appropriate bonus to hit, and this dexterity gives you a bonus to hit in combat, strength only gives you a bonus to damage. I used that mechanic back in 2nd edition, so I was familiar with it, and I don't have a problem with it. Of course, your more skilled people will have a bonus to this attack, and you can have feats that bring it up even higher. And of course, magic weapons would make it even better. So it's a familiar mechanic. It's no different than any other OGL means of handling it. The damage, however, is different, and I'm going to give a brief description. They don't use hit points in this game. They use wound conditions. And so if you get hit, you make a saving throw, a toughness roll. It's a 4th saving throw, along with will, fort, and dex. And the toughness roll means you can avoid taking damage, and if you fail to avoid taking the damage, the degree by which you make that failed roll will affect how much damage you have taken. Now your will save, your toughness save is going to be a base 15, a DC of 15, and it's modified. For example, you have a high score of your con, it's going to give you a bonus on your roll. If your score is low because you have a low score or you're wounded at the moment, if you're taking poison damage or something, that's going to adversely affect your roll. The damage of a weapon, again, as I mentioned, it's a simple +1 or +2 or +3. That will increase the DC of your roll. If you've taken a lot of damage from a two-handed sword, then you have to have, it's more difficult to resist than, saying, being pricked by a dagger. And if you fail it by 5 or more, for example, you have 4 conditions of non-lethal damage. You have bruise, dazed, staggered, unconscious. And there are 4 conditions of lethal: hurt, wounded, disabled, dying, and of course the last most important one, dead. So if you don't like hit points and you have a problem with the inflation that hit points can sometimes bring to a game, this game eliminates them completely. It's a good job. It's not a mechanic I think that everyone's going to be happy with. I have not used it myself out here in the old meat space, but I'd be willing to give it a try. And I think it really does make things a lot simpler. There's less math, and there's more equitable in some ways. Fighter types are going to have a better resistance. They can also spend your feats to increase your toughness. Oh yes, one mention of feats. Everybody in this game gets a feat every single level. So again, you can customize your characters really easily. You're not going to be straitjacketed into anything in this game, which is great. Of course, some feats do have prerequisites. Then, of course, you have hazards, acid, cold, heat, things like that. Then we get into narrating the game, and they refer to the GM, and this is a narrator, which I don't have a problem with. And we have assigning difficulty levels, secret checks, altering the outcome of die rolls, faking it, saying yes to your players, and heroic advancement. Then we have adversaries, or ordinaries and minions, and then you have creatures, and they give how to create and use some of the generic creatures presented in the game already, the OGL, and how to use them in this game. There is a short, like 8 or 9 page bestiary in here, and or bestiary, and there is a bestiary available for this game, which I have not yet read. It's in my queue. Then we talk about some different ways of using this generic system to create specific campaigns, and they present you with 4 sample campaigns. Each is about 20 pages long, like 15, 20 pages long. And the first is the Caliphate Knights, Caliphate, whatever. It's an Islamic-based world in the Arabian Nights genre. Dashing heroes going out and saving the damsel in distress, but in an Arabian setting. And I think they did a really nice job with this. You have to be comfortable with running a world that is very much a monotheistic religion. And some people are going to be okay with that, and some people aren't. And so that may make or break your interest in that, but they do a good job. Then they have the Lux Aeternum, which is a science fiction-based game, which is kind of the retelling of the Age of Discovery in our own past, but in the future setting. And I think they take that theme a little too far for my taste. I want a little more Firefly and a little less Dumas, but it still presents you with a nice background you can easily modify it to fit your tastes. Then they have the Mecha versus Kaiju, which is giant robots fighting giant monsters, which was quite entertaining, and shows you again how these rules can be used on a larger scale if you so choose. And then we have Borrowed Time, which is essentially their version of the Time Lords, which was well presented, and I think did a good job. My only problem with time travel is there's so many historical details that you have to keep track of to do it well, and I just don't think I'm up to it, man. If you're doing time traveling in a fantasy or a future science fiction setting, it's a whole lot easier because it hasn't happened or it didn't happen. But if you're doing time traveling in our era, everybody's going to be nitpicking if you get something wrong. And I prefer multi-universe topping as opposed to time traveling. There's more wiggle room in there, but that's just me. And then we have how to convert traditional D20 things over into 220, character sheet index, and of course the license. So you'll notice that the time on this has gone long because I've been allowed to make longer videos because YouTube is doing that now. But I am still going to try to wrap this up. I will cover other 220 books in a future video or series of videos, and I have a number of them I'm currently reading and a number I want to read. But I think I may do all of them in one video because I don't think they're going to need that much detail. But True20 is a generic version of the OGL. I think it completely succeeds at its goal. It simplifies things a little, makes everything generic a whole lot, and I think presents it in a manner that is very approachable to anyone who's familiar with the D20 system, and approachable enough by those who are coming at this from the outside who have never dealt with the D20 system, that by making it simpler, it's going to be more approachable and easier for everyone to handle. An excellent job. I'm glad I read it, and I wish I had read it earlier because it's a good product, man. It does what it says on the tin, and it does it well.